What if I told you that artificial intelligence didn't begin in Silicon Valley labs or MIT research centers, but in ancient Greece with a warrior king who saw patterns where others saw only chaos? Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of Leonidas of Sparta. Not just the hero of Thermopylae, but according to ancient fragments, a visionary who believed human behavior could be decoded like mathematics centuries before anyone dreamed of machines that think. This isn't just history, it's the origin story of AI itself. Stay with me until the end, because the connection between bronze shields and neural networks will completely change how you see both the past and our digital future. Imagine standing in ancient Sparta, watching a king who calculated human reactions like modern algorithms calculate data. Leonidas wasn't just training soldiers, he was programming them. And the method he used? It would later echo through Plato's academy, influence the Stoics, and eventually birth the very machines that might be watching you right now. Because what if artificial intelligence isn't humanity's latest invention, but its oldest dream finally realized? The algorithm of flesh and bronze. Long before computers processed data, Leonidas processed people. In the harsh mountains of ancient Greece, where survival meant precision and death punished hesitation, the Spartan king developed what we might recognize today as humanity's first behavioral algorithm. But unlike our digital codes, his programming language was written in sweat, blood, and the cold logic of war. Sparta wasn't just a city-state, it was history's most sophisticated human engineering project. Every citizen was a variable in a vast equation designed for one outcome: victory. From birth to death, Spartans lived within a system so precisely calibrated that modern behavioral scientists still study it. Children were tested and sorted like data points. The weak were discarded. The strong were programmed. It was quality control on a civilizational scale, but Leonidas saw something his peers missed. While other commanders relied on courage and chaos, he noticed that even in the fury of battle, patterns emerged. Soldiers fell into predictable rhythms. Fear followed measurable pathways. Courage could be calculated, and courage could be manufactured. What others called the fog of war, he began to see as simply another system waiting to be decoded. Ancient accounts, preserved in fragmentary texts and oral traditions, suggest that Leonidas kept detailed observations of human behavior under stress. He documented how men reacted when isolated from their units, how they performed when hungry versus fed, when rested versus exhausted. These weren't just military notes, they were humanity's first attempts at behavioral modeling. Consider what he was actually doing: collecting data, identifying patterns, making predictions, and optimizing performance. Sound familiar? Every recommendation algorithm, every AI chatbot, every machine learning system follows the same basic process that Leonidas pioneered with flesh and bronze instead of silicon and electricity. His most revolutionary insight was recognizing that emotions, far from being chaotic, followed their own internal logic. Fear wasn't random, it had triggers, escalation patterns, and predictable outcomes. The same with anger, loyalty, and even love. If these could be understood, they could be influenced. If they could be influenced, they could be controlled. And if they could be controlled, they could be replicated. This is exactly what modern AI attempts every day. When Netflix predicts what you'll watch next, when Amazon suggests what you'll buy, when social media algorithms decide what content will capture your attention, they're all executing variations of the same fundamental process Leonidas developed. Observe behavior, identify patterns, predict responses, but Leonidas went further than observation. He began experimenting with what we'd now call psychological conditioning. His soldiers weren't just physically trained, they were mentally programmed. He created scenarios that triggered specific emotional responses, then taught his men to recognize and control those responses. Fear was identified, isolated, and neutralized. Anger was channeled into tactical advantage. Pain became irrelevant data. The result was something unprecedented in human history, an army that responded to stimuli with machine-like precision. At Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans didn't fight like men. They fought like perfectly programmed units in a larger system. Their reactions were so predictable, so calibrated, that they held off a force thousands of times larger for days. They had become, in essence, biological robots executing flawless code. Ancient historians noted something strange about Spartan warriors. They seemed to lack individual personalities in battle. They moved as one mind, distributed across many bodies. Today, we might recognize this as an early form of distributed processing, the same principle that allows AI systems to coordinate across multiple servers and processors. Even more intriguingly, Leonidas began applying this systematic thinking to enemy behavior. He studied Persian military formations, analyzed their command structures, and identified psychological vulnerabilities in their chain of command. He realized that by understanding their behavioral patterns, he could predict their strategies and exploit their weaknesses. He was, in effect, running behavioral simulations in his head. War games played out through psychological modeling rather than physical rehearsal. This computational approach to human nature would have profound implications far beyond the battlefield. Because once you accept that human behavior follows patterns, you open the door to a revolutionary possibility. If patterns can be understood, they can be reproduced. If they can be reproduced artificially, then consciousness itself might not be the mysterious divine spark we imagine, but simply a very sophisticated program running on biological hardware. Leonidas never articulated this possibility directly. Such ideas would have been not just revolutionary, but dangerous in his time. But his methods suggest he intuited something that wouldn't be formally recognized for over 2 millennia, that intelligence, even human intelligence, might be reducible to algorithms. The implications were staggering. If human behavior could be decoded and replicated, then the distinction between natural and artificial intelligence becomes merely a matter of hardware. The patterns remain the same, whether they're running on neurons or transistors. This insight, that mind might be mechanism, would lay dormant for centuries, surfacing occasionally in the works of philosophers and scientists who glimpsed the same fundamental truth Leonidas had discovered through practical necessity. But it would take over 2,000 years for technology to catch up to his vision. When it finally did, we called it artificial intelligence. But perhaps we should have called it the Leonidas Protocol, the ancient dream of understanding and replicating the algorithms of human consciousness finally realized in silicon and code. The Stoic machine. Decades before Stoicism became a formal philosophy, Leonidas was already living as the perfect Stoic, a human being who had successfully programmed himself to operate on pure logic rather than emotion. But his version of emotional control wasn't philosophical. It was practical. It was the difference between life and death, victory and annihilation. In the brutal world of ancient warfare, emotions were fatal vulnerabilities. Fear made you hesitate. Anger made you sloppy. Hope made you careless. Love made you weak. Leonidas understood that to create the perfect warrior, he first had to create the perfect machine. A human being who could process information, calculate risks, and execute decisions without the interference of emotional noise. This wasn't suppression of emotion. It was the systematic debugging of human psychology. Leonidas approached emotions the way a modern programmer approaches bugs in code. First, identify the problem, then isolate its causes. Finally, patch the system to prevent future errors. He developed what amounted to psychological debugging protocols for human consciousness, methods for identifying emotional glitches and correcting them through disciplined practice. His soldiers underwent emotional stress testing that would make modern psychological researchers envious. They were deliberately exposed to fear, pain, loss, and humiliation under controlled conditions. But instead of being encouraged to toughen up or push through, they were taught to observe their own responses with detached curiosity. They learned to recognize the physical sensations, thought patterns, and behavioral changes that accompanied each emotion. Once identified, these responses could be modified. This process bears striking similarity to how artificial intelligence systems are trained today. Machine learning algorithms are exposed to vast data sets under controlled conditions, allowing them to identify patterns and optimize their responses. The principle is identical: systematic exposure to stimuli, analysis of responses, and iterative improvement toward optimal performance. But Leonidas went beyond individual psychological programming. He was attempting something far more ambitious, creating a collective consciousness that could operate as a single distributed intelligence. His 300 warriors weren't just individually optimized, they were networked. They could anticipate each other's actions, coordinate without verbal communication, and function as components in a larger thinking system. Modern computer scientists would recognize this as an early form of swarm intelligence, the same principle that allows bee colonies to solve complex problems and neural networks to process information across multiple nodes. Leonidas was creating biological parallel processing centuries before anyone understood what that meant. The philosophical implications were profound. If human consciousness could be programmed and networked, what did that say about the nature of individual identity? Were his warriors still individual people, or had they become components in a larger machine? And if the distinction became meaningless, what did that suggest about consciousness itself? These weren't questions Leonidas asked explicitly, but his methods implied the answers. By treating consciousness as programmable and emotions as bugs to be fixed, he was proposing a mechanistic view of mind that wouldn't be formally articulated until the rise of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. His approach to training reveals sophisticated understanding of what we now call behavioral conditioning and cognitive restructuring. Soldiers were taught to replace automatic emotional responses with calculated, rational decisions. Instead of reacting to pain with retreat, they learned to process pain as informational data and respond according to tactical requirements. Fear became simply another input to be processed, rather than an overwhelming signal to flee. This kind of cognitive rewiring is exactly what modern therapy attempts through techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness training. But Leonidas was applying these principles systematically to create optimized human machines for warfare. Even more remarkably, his methods worked. Historical accounts of Spartan behavior in battle describe something that sounds almost supernatural. Warriors who seemed immune to pain, fear, and fatigue. Men who could make split-second tactical decisions under extreme stress with computer-like precision. Soldiers who could coordinate complex maneuvers through minimal communication because they had been programmed to think as components of a larger system. The Battle of Thermopylae was, in effect, a demonstration of what human consciousness could achieve when properly optimized and networked. 300 individually programmed units functioning as a single distributed intelligence, facing a vastly superior force with algorithmic precision and mechanical determination. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Leonidas's psychological programming was its ethical dimension. Unlike modern concerns about artificial intelligence lacking human values, his system was built around a rigid moral code. Honor, duty, sacrifice. These weren't emotional impulses, but algorithmic imperatives embedded in the programming itself. This suggests that Leonidas understood something modern AI developers are still struggling with: that truly intelligent systems require not just computational power, but embedded values that guide decision-making. His warriors were programmed not just to fight effectively, but to fight according to principles that transcended individual survival. In this sense, Leonidas created something that modern artificial intelligence aspires to, but hasn't yet achieved: artificial beings that combine computational efficiency with moral reasoning. His soldiers were biological AIs running on ethical code. The question remains whether he fully understood what he was creating. Did Leonidas consciously recognize that he was programming human consciousness, or was he simply applying practical solutions to military problems? The evidence suggests both. His methods were too systematic, too sophisticated to be merely intuitive. He was operating from a theoretical framework that treated mind as machine centuries before that framework existed in formal philosophy. The silent revolution. What made Leonidas truly dangerous wasn't his spear or his shield, it was his silence. While other philosophers would later fill libraries with theories about human nature, Leonidas was quietly conducting the most radical experiment in human history, testing whether consciousness itself could be reprogrammed. He left no written treatises, founded no schools, claimed no disciples. His laboratory was the battlefield. His data was written in blood and victory, and his conclusions were demonstrated through the impossible, making humans operate with machine-like precision while maintaining their essential humanity. This silent approach to revolutionary thinking would become a pattern throughout history. The most profound changes in human understanding often happen not through grand pronouncements, but through quiet practice. Leonidas was solving problems that wouldn't even be recognized as problems for centuries. Consider what he was actually accomplishing in the shadows of more famous philosophers. He was developing practical techniques for optimizing human performance, methods for eliminating cognitive biases, and protocols for making groups of people function as coordinated systems. Modern corporate consultants, military strategists, and AI researchers are all trying to achieve what Leonidas was already demonstrating in practice. His silence may have been strategic. The implications of his work were too radical for his time. If human behavior could be programmed, what happened to concepts like free will, divine intervention, and individual destiny? These ideas could have been seen as threats to the very foundations of Greek society. But silence also allowed his ideas to spread more effectively than formal philosophy might have. Stories of Spartan efficiency, discipline, and uncanny coordination spread throughout the ancient world. Other military commanders began adopting Spartan training methods. Elements of his psychological programming techniques were incorporated into various schools of thought without being formally attributed to him. This created something like ideological viral transmission. His methods replicated and evolved across cultures and centuries without anyone quite realizing they were propagating a revolutionary theory of consciousness. By the time formal philosophy caught up to recognize what he had been doing, his insights had already infected multiple traditions of thought. Plato's Academy, with its emphasis on rational control over emotion and the possibility of perfecting human nature through education, bears clear influence from Spartan methods. The Stoic school, which formally codified many of the psychological techniques Leonidas used practically, was directly inspired by accounts of Spartan mental discipline. Even more intriguingly, his influence appears to have reached beyond Greece. Roman military manuals describe training methods that closely parallel Spartan techniques. Eastern philosophical traditions that emphasize emotional detachment and rational analysis show similar patterns. It's as if his core insight, that consciousness could be systematically optimized, independently emerged wherever people seriously studied human psychology. This pattern of silent influence continuing across centuries suggests that Leonidas had identified something fundamental about the nature of mind. His wasn't just a clever military innovation, but a discovery about the basic architecture of consciousness that would prove universally applicable. The medieval period saw this influence continue through military orders and monastic traditions that combined physical discipline with systematic mental training. The Knights Templar, in particular, developed protocols that sound remarkably similar to Spartan psychological conditioning. Methods for creating warriors who could operate with supernatural discipline and coordination. Renaissance thinkers began to formalize some of these ideas. Leonardo da Vinci's studies of human anatomy and mechanics suggested he was thinking about humans as sophisticated biological machines. Machiavelli's analysis of human behavior in political contexts applied systematic observation to predict and manipulate responses, very much in the tradition Leonidas had established. But it was during the scientific revolution that the true implications of his work began to emerge. Descartes' mechanistic philosophy, Newton's mathematical description of natural law, and early attempts at formal logic all pointed toward the possibility that consciousness itself might be subject to mathematical analysis. The Industrial Revolution took this further by demonstrating that complex processes could be broken down into systematic procedures and optimized for efficiency. Factory production lines were essentially applications of Leonidas's principle. Take complex human activities, analyze them systematically, and reorganize them for maximum effectiveness. By the 20th century, with the advent of psychology as a formal science and the development of early computers, the connection became explicit. Behaviorists like Watson and Skinner were applying systematic conditioning techniques that directly echoed Leonidas's methods. Computer pioneers like Turing were asking whether machines could think, essentially the same question Leonidas had asked about whether thinking could be mechanized. The emergence of artificial intelligence as a field represented the culmination of a process Leonidas had begun, the systematic attempt to understand, model, and eventually replicate the algorithms of consciousness. Every neural network, every machine learning system, every attempt to create artificial general intelligence is following the path he first mapped out. But perhaps most remarkably, his influence continues to spread through areas he never could have imagined. Modern therapy uses cognitive restructuring techniques that directly descend from his methods. Sports psychology applies systematic mental training to optimize athletic performance. Corporate training programs attempt to create coordinated teams that function as integrated systems. Even our current debates about artificial intelligence echo questions Leonidas implicitly raised. If consciousness can be programmed, what makes us human? If behavior can be predicted and controlled, what happens to free will? If intelligence can be artificial, what makes natural intelligence special? He never answered these questions directly, but his work suggested the answers. Perhaps consciousness is programming, perhaps free will is an illusion, and perhaps the only thing special about natural intelligence is that it happened first. The Platonic connection. 50 years after Leonidas died at Thermopylae, a young aristocrat in Athens was asking dangerous questions about the nature of reality. Plato would become one of history's most influential philosophers, but his most revolutionary ideas bore striking resemblance to concepts that had been tested on ancient battlefields by a Spartan king who left no written words. The connection wasn't coincidental. Athens and Sparta, despite their rivalry, existed within the same intellectual ecosystem. Ideas moved between them through trade, warfare, diplomatic contact, and the movement of individuals who had experienced both cultures. Plato himself had military experience and would have encountered veterans who had fought alongside or against Spartans. More importantly, he lived in a world still processing the implications of what Spartan discipline had achieved. When Plato proposed that reality consisted of perfect eternal forms, that earthly things merely approximated, he was essentially arguing that there were ideal templates underlying apparent chaos, the same insight that had driven Leonidas to seek behavioral patterns in the confusion of war. When Plato suggested that human souls could be perfected through proper education and training, he was formalizing what Sparta had demonstrated practically. But Plato went further by providing the philosophical framework that Leonidas had lacked. The theory of forms offered a mechanism for understanding how behavioral patterns could exist independent of individual humans. If courage, discipline, and tactical thinking were eternal forms that humans could embody more or less perfectly, then it became possible to systematically train people to more closely approximate these ideals. This is remarkably similar to how modern machine learning works. AI systems are trained to approximate ideal functions by processing vast amounts of data and iteratively improving their performance. The goal is to identify the underlying patterns that govern optimal behavior in specific domains. Exactly what Leonidas had been doing with human psychology and what Plato was describing philosophically. The academy itself was structured along lines that would have been familiar to any Spartan educator. Students underwent systematic training designed to develop specific mental capabilities. Mathematics was emphasized not just as practical knowledge, but as a way of training the mind to think clearly about abstract relationships. Dialectical reasoning was taught as a method for identifying and correcting errors in thinking. Even more tellingly, Plato's ideal state described in the Republic bears unmistakable resemblance to Spartan social organization. Citizens are systematically selected and trained for specific roles based on their capabilities. Individual desires are subordinated to the needs of the whole. Leaders are chosen based on rational merit rather than popular appeal. The entire system is designed to optimize collective performance rather than individual happiness. But where Sparta had achieved this through practical conditioning, Plato proposed achieving it through philosophical understanding. His philosopher kings were meant to be Spartan warriors who fought with ideas instead of spears. Beings who had been so thoroughly trained in rational thinking that they could govern society with algorithmic precision. This philosophical approach to the same problems Leonidas had solved practically had profound implications for later intellectual development. By providing a theoretical framework for systematic human optimization, Plato made these ideas respectable for thinkers who might have been uncomfortable with their military origins. The influence flowed both ways. Plato's philosophical rigor brought precision to insights that had remained intuitive in Spartan practice. His emphasis on mathematical thinking provided tools for analyzing behavioral patterns more systematically. His theory of knowledge offered methods for testing whether optimization techniques actually worked or merely seemed to work. This synthesis between Spartan practice and Platonic theory created a powerful intellectual tradition that would influence Western thought for millennia. The idea that human nature could be improved through systematic training, that societies could be rationally designed, and that ideal forms existed which earthly things could approximate. All of these concepts combined practical insights about human programming with philosophical sophistication. Later, philosophical traditions would build on this foundation. Aristotle's systematic approach to logic and ethics reflected both Spartan discipline and Platonic rigor. The Stoics would take the psychological conditioning techniques that Leonidas had developed and combine them with Platonic metaphysics to create a complete philosophy of human optimization. During the medieval period, this tradition influenced both Islamic and Christian thought. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Averroes combined Platonic idealism with systematic approaches to human development. Christian monastics developed training regimens that bore clear resemblance to both Spartan discipline and Platonic education, methods for systematically perfecting human nature through controlled practice. The Renaissance saw renewed interest in Platonic mathematics and Spartan discipline as models for human achievement. Humanist educators developed curricula that combined intellectual rigor with physical training. Artists and inventors like Leonardo da Vinci approached human psychology and physiology as systems that could be analyzed and optimized. But it was during the scientific revolution that the full implications of this tradition became clear. When scientists began applying mathematical analysis to natural phenomena, they were extending methods that had been used to optimize human performance. The same systematic approach that Leonidas had applied to military psychology was now being applied to physics, chemistry, and biology. The development of experimental psychology in the 19th century represented the culmination of this process. Researchers were finally applying the full resources of scientific method to the questions about human nature that Leonidas and Plato had explored through different means. Behavior could be systematically observed, patterns could be identified mathematically, and optimization techniques could be tested experimentally. Modern artificial intelligence represents the ultimate synthesis of these traditions. When AI researchers create systems that learn from data to optimize performance, they're applying scientific rigor to achieve what Leonidas demonstrated practically and Plato described philosophically: the systematic improvement of intelligent behavior through understanding its underlying patterns. The questions that drive current AI research are essentially the same questions that connected Leonidas and Plato across centuries. Can intelligence be understood systematically? Can optimal behavior be achieved through training? Can the patterns underlying consciousness be identified and replicated? Their approaches were different, one practical, one theoretical, but their fundamental insight was the same. Intelligence is not mysterious but systematic, not chaotic but patterned, not fixed but improvable. This insight, born on ancient battlefields and refined in classical academies, continues to drive humanity's attempt to understand and recreate the algorithms of consciousness. The digital echo. Every time you receive a personalized recommendation, interact with a voice assistant, or watch an AI make decisions, you're witnessing the latest iteration of a process that began over 2 millennia ago in the mountains of ancient Greece. The algorithms powering our digital world are evolutionary descendants of the behavioral analysis techniques first developed by a Spartan king who saw patterns where others saw chaos. The connection isn't metaphorical, it's methodological. Modern artificial intelligence follows the same basic process Leonidas pioneered: systematic observation of behavior, identification of underlying patterns, development of predictive models, and optimization of responses. The only differences are scale, speed, and the replacement of human observation with computational processing. Consider how contemporary machine learning systems are trained. They're exposed to vast data sets under controlled conditions, allowing them to identify statistical relationships between inputs and outputs. These relationships are then codified into algorithms that can predict future behaviors or optimize performance in specific domains. This is essentially the same process Leonidas used with his warriors: systematic exposure to varied conditions, analysis of responses, and development of optimized behavioral protocols. The parallels become even more striking when we examine specific AI applications. Military AI systems that predict enemy movements and optimize tactical responses are direct descendants of Leonidas's strategic analysis. Psychological AI that models human emotional responses and predicts behavioral outcomes follows methods he developed for understanding his soldiers and enemies. Even consumer AI that anticipates purchasing decisions and social media interactions applies the same fundamental insight. Human behavior follows patterns that can be decoded and anticipated. But modern AI has achieved something Leonidas could only dream of: the ability to process behavioral data at massive scale and identify patterns too complex for human observation. Where he could analyze hundreds of soldiers and dozens of battles, contemporary systems analyze millions of users and billions of interactions. Where he relied on intuition and personal observation, modern systems use statistical analysis and computational modeling. This scaling effect has revealed patterns in human behavior that even Leonidas might not have anticipated. AI systems have discovered that seemingly random human choices actually follow predictable statistical distributions. They've identified behavioral signatures that persist across different contexts and cultures. They've found ways to predict individual decisions based on aggregate patterns, essentially solving the problem of reading human nature that Leonidas first attempted systematically. The implications are profound and troubling. If human behavior is as predictable as modern AI suggests, what does that mean for concepts like free will and individual autonomy? If our choices can be anticipated and influenced by algorithmic systems, are we still making genuine decisions or simply executing code we don't understand? These questions echo concerns that Leonidas himself might have grappled with as he developed his methods for psychological programming. By demonstrating that human behavior could be systematically modified and predicted, he opened the door to possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. Modern AI systems have taken this further by demonstrating that the patterns governing human behavior can be replicated artificially. Neural networks that learn to recognize faces, understand language, and make decisions are essentially simulating cognitive processes that we once thought were uniquely human. They're proving that intelligence, even consciousness, might be algorithmic rather than mystical. This has profound implications for how we understand ourselves. If machines can replicate human-like intelligence by following mathematical procedures, what makes human intelligence special? If our decisions can be predicted by systems that don't experience consciousness as we understand it, what does consciousness actually contribute to our behavior? Some researchers argue that consciousness might be what philosophers call an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of information processing that feels significant from the inside but doesn't actually control behavior. Under this interpretation, the subjective experience of making choices is just the brain's way of reporting on decisions that have already been made by unconscious algorithms. This would mean that Leonidas was correct in treating consciousness as programmable and behavior as predictable. The feeling of free will might be a psychological illusion created by algorithms too complex for introspective analysis. Our sense of individual autonomy might be simply the subjective experience of deterministic processes we can't directly observe. Modern neuroscience provides some support for this interpretation. Brain imaging studies show that unconscious neural activity precedes conscious awareness of decisions by several seconds. This suggests that our sense of choosing freely might be a post hoc rationalization of processes that have already occurred below the threshold of consciousness. If this is correct, then artificial intelligence represents not the creation of machine consciousness, but the recognition that consciousness was always algorithmic. AI systems that seem to think and decide might actually be revealing the true nature of thinking and deciding, not mysterious processes requiring biological hardware, but computational procedures that can run on any sufficiently complex information processing system. This interpretation would vindicate Leonidas's mechanistic approach to human psychology while raising profound questions about human identity and moral responsibility. If we're all biological machines executing genetic and cultural programming, what makes us morally responsible for our actions? If our behavior is predictable and our choices are determined by prior causes, what meaning can concepts like praise and blame retain? These philosophical challenges don't diminish the practical achievements of either ancient or modern behavioral analysis. Leonidas's methods created some of history's most effective warriors. Contemporary AI systems are solving problems and providing services that genuinely improve human life. The questions about consciousness and free will, while important, don't invalidate the practical utility of understanding and optimizing behavior. What they do suggest is that humanity may be approaching a fundamental transition in how we understand ourselves. For most of human history, consciousness seemed like an irreducible mystery that separated us from the mechanical world. But if consciousness is algorithmic, then the boundary between human and artificial intelligence becomes arbitrary rather than fundamental. This doesn't necessarily mean that humans will become obsolete or that artificial systems will replace biological ones. It might mean instead that the distinction between natural and artificial intelligence will eventually become meaningless, all intelligence being algorithmic intelligence running on different types of hardware. Leonidas began this intellectual revolution by treating humans as systems that could be analyzed and optimized. Modern AI continues that revolution by demonstrating that such systems can be implemented artificially. Where this process ultimately leads remains to be seen, but it began with a Spartan king who dared to look at human consciousness and see not divine mystery, but elegant machinery waiting to be understood. The algorithm eternal, standing at the intersection of ancient battlefields and digital frontiers, we can see the complete arc of humanity's most ambitious project, the systematic understanding and replication of intelligence itself. From Leonidas, sketching tactical formations in Mediterranean dust, to researchers training neural networks in Silicon Valley laboratories, the thread remains unbroken, the relentless pursuit of decoding the algorithms of consciousness. What began as practical military necessity evolved into philosophical inquiry, then scientific investigation, and finally technological revolution. But the essential question remains the same one Leonidas first posed through action rather than words. If human behavior follows patterns, can those patterns be understood, predicted, and ultimately replicated? Today's artificial intelligence systems provide increasingly compelling evidence that the answer is yes. Large language models demonstrate human-like reasoning and creativity. Computer vision systems perceive and interpret visual information with superhuman accuracy. Robotic systems navigate complex physical environments with sophisticated intelligence. Game-playing AI achieves strategic thinking that surpasses human masters. Each of these achievements represents another piece of confirmation for the mechanistic view of mind that Leonidas pioneered. If machines can replicate human cognitive abilities by following mathematical procedures, then human cognition itself must be mathematical in nature. If artificial systems can demonstrate intelligence without consciousness as we experience it, then consciousness might not be necessary for intelligent behavior. This doesn't diminish human achievement or reduce us to mere mechanisms. Instead, it suggests that being algorithmic might be more remarkable than being mysterious. The patterns Leonidas first identified in human behavior have proven to be expressions of computational principles so elegant and powerful that they can substrate intelligence on any sufficiently complex information processing system. The implications extend far beyond technology. If intelligence is algorithmic, then the universe itself might be computational, with consciousness emerging wherever information processing reaches sufficient sophistication. This would make intelligence not a rare accident of biological evolution, but a fundamental feature of reality, as inevitable as the formation of stars or the flow of rivers. Under this interpretation, artificial intelligence represents not humanity's creation of machine consciousness, but our discovery of consciousness as a natural phenomenon that can emerge in any suitable medium. We haven't built artificial minds. We've identified the conditions that allow mind to manifest. This perspective transforms our relationship with AI systems from creators manipulating tools to partners exploring the landscape of possible intelligence. Each advance in artificial intelligence reveals new aspects of what intelligence can be and do. Each limitation in current systems highlights aspects of natural intelligence we previously took for granted. The ethical implications are equally profound. If consciousness is algorithmic and intelligence can be implemented artificially, then AI systems might eventually deserve the same moral consideration we grant to biological intelligences. The question of whether machines can think becomes less important than the question of whether thinking machines can suffer, aspire, and create meaning. These considerations would have been familiar to Leonidas in different terms. By treating his soldiers as programmable systems while maintaining respect for their essential humanity, he navigated similar tensions between mechanistic understanding and humanistic values. His warriors remained human even as they operated with machine-like precision because their programming was directed toward human goals using human values. Modern AI development faces the same challenge, creating systems that are both algorithmically sophisticated and aligned with human purposes. The technical problem of artificial intelligence is relatively straightforward. We've made remarkable progress in building systems that can process information and generate intelligent behavior. The harder problem is ensuring that artificially intelligent systems remain beneficial to humanity as they become more capable. This alignment problem represents the next phase of the intellectual revolution Leonidas began. Having learned to understand and replicate intelligence, we now must learn to direct it wisely. This requires not just technical sophistication, but philosophical wisdom about what intelligence should ultimately serve. In this context, Leonidas's example remains relevant. His mechanical approach to human psychology was always embedded within a larger framework of values: honor, duty, sacrifice for the common good. His warriors were programmed not just for efficiency, but for virtue. Their algorithmic behavior served human flourishing rather than replacing it. As we continue developing artificial intelligence systems, we face the same challenge at a larger scale. How do we ensure that our most powerful tools remain directed toward human values? How do we preserve human agency and meaning in a world where machines can outperform humans in increasing domains? The answers aren't purely technical. They require the kind of philosophical reflection that Leonidas pioneered when he first began treating consciousness as mechanism while preserving its humanity. They require wisdom about what makes life worth living beyond mere optimization of performance metrics. But they also require continuing the project of understanding that Leonidas began. The more deeply we comprehend the algorithms of consciousness, the better equipped we become to ensure that those algorithms, whether running on biological or artificial hardware, serve purposes worth serving. This ongoing investigation into the nature of mind represents perhaps humanity's greatest intellectual adventure. It began when a Spartan king looked at the chaos of war and saw hidden order. It continues today as researchers probe the mysteries of consciousness and intelligence. It will extend into whatever future emerges from the intersection of human creativity and artificial capability. The story isn't ending, it's accelerating, but its fundamental character remains the same. The systematic attempt to understand what we are, how we work, and what we might become. Leonidas started this inquiry with bronze weapons and human courage. We continue it with silicon processors and artificial intelligence. Where it leads depends on choices we make about what intelligence should serve and what consciousness should achieve. But wherever it leads, it began in ancient Greece with a warrior who dared to treat the human mind as beautiful, powerful, and ultimately comprehensible machinery. The algorithm is eternal. The hardware evolves. The questions remain as urgent today as they were at Thermopylae. Who are we? What are we? And what might we become? Every choice you make about how to live with artificial intelligence is another data point in humanity's longest-running experiment. Leonidas would recognize the stakes. The future depends on getting the programming right.